And hello. I hope everybody's doing well today. It is Dr. Chris Roddenberry coming to you live from Willow Springs, North Carolina. Can you hear me? If you can hear me, go ahead and type in the chat bar and let me know that I'm coming through loud and clear. If you could, I'd like to welcome everybody. Thanks for coming, Bria. Thanks for coming, Alicia. Thanks for coming, Jenna. Fantastic. Okay, awesome. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for coming to my Psychology 150 lectures for my 8-week class. These are going to be live lectures the entire semester. And for the 16-week class, the first ones are going to be live, and then you can watch these broadcasts recorded if you like. During today's lecture, if you do have any questions, feel free to type them in your chat bar. I'm monitoring that right up front. And I've also got my cell phone right here in front of me. So if you want to send me a remind text chat to ask a question, you should feel completely free to do that. Unlike most classes, you are encouraged to talk to your classmates while the lecture is going on. So if you feel like talking to what I'm talking about stirs thoughts or ideas in your head that you want to mention to your other classmates, feel free to type this into your chat bar and discuss with your other classmates while the lecture is going on. This lecture is completely for you, so whatever it is I can do to help you understand the material is what I am interested in doing. Okay, do we have any questions so far? I don't have any text coming in my phone, and I don't have anything in the chat bar. So, from what I understand, you can hear me, you can see me, and it is now 1:01. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin talking about psychology. Okay, so module one, the first week that we're talking about is called the Four Epochs of Psychology. And what I'm going to try to do today is to give you a good appreciation of the historical perspective in which psychology develops. So I'm going to do two things actually. I'm going to introduce you to what psychology is, try to convince you why you need to take it. And then I'm going to try to give you sort of a historical framework so you can see where psychology is right now. And more importantly, maybe you can even see where psychology is going in the future. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with this presentation, shall we? Okay. The one thing they tell us all as educators, adult educators, is that your adult learners need to understand why they are learning something. Unlike kids who will learn whatever you tell them, whenever you tell them, adults are a little more refined and are only willing to give their cognitive effort if they can really understand why they are learning something. And so, what I'd like to do is to suggest to you that studying psychology, even though you may not be a psych major, is the most important thing you can do in college to help you have a successful life. Right now, I didn't really think about it, but when I was in high school, I took a typing class. I didn't think it was very important. You guys would call it keyboarding now. I took a typing class. I just took it to fulfill a requirement, and I wasn't interested in it at all. And it turns out that typing was the most important class that I've ever taken, and it's really helped me professionally. You know what? Even though psychology is something that a perspective, a class that you may not be directly interested in, it may turn out to be the most important class you can take. And why is this? Do you want to be happier? Do you want to understand your strengths, your weakness? How many of you feel like you are not as productive as you possibly could be? Do we have anybody in here suffering from relationship problems? Hmm? Are some of you stuck with what I'd like to call suburban disease? you have trouble figuring out what kind of meaning there is in life? Do you folks want to live a better life? Everything, all of these goals can be fulfilled if you will understand psychology and how you work and function as a human being. So this class could be very, very helpful for you. I'm sitting here looking in the chat bar. Can anybody tell me, generally speaking, don't spill your guts too much, but tell us what's one thing you would like to learn or you would like to improve on that you think this class could help. Looking at what I've listed here about the things that I think psychology can help you do, what one thing would you like to work on this semester, or do you think would be the most useful for you to learn this semester? Right? And if you look right underneath me, this very famous philosopher, Socrates, suggested that to know thyself is the beginning of wisdom. Jessica Schwartz wants to be better, more productive. Bailey Dyson wants to manage time better, which is to be more productive. Holy cow, sounds like we've got a theme going on. People would like to be just a little more productive. I understand exactly what you're saying. Why is it so difficult to be productive, do you think, these days? What is it about your life that makes it so difficult to be productive? If anybody has a clue, go ahead and type that in the chat bar. Meanwhile, I'm going to move on with the one suggestion that I can help you become the master of your ship. Instead of the world controlling you, why don't you learn to control yourself and ultimately the world to make it what you want, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. Psychology is the study of what it means to be human. All right, it's a science just like all the other sciences, but what you're going to notice is that it also tends to incorporate a lot of things, some biology, some chemistry, some anthropology, some sociology. Psychology is going to be sort of a combination of all of these sciences. Because all of these sciences focus on aspects of being human, they're a part of the study of psychology. And so the goal for this class and for this module is to help you understand how we got to the study of what it means to be human. Now, if you look here at the academic definition, psychology is the scientific study of how people think, feel, and behave with a focus on how these things are related uh, to the nervous system. So that's sort of a general definition of psychology. You're going to find it in every textbook. You're going to find it on web pages. If you Google this, look in Wikipedia, you're going to find that this is the general academic definition. Now, it's going to focus on some very important issues. Number one, it's scientific. We're going to talk about what that means next week. And we're going to talk about thinking, feeling, and behaving, three different aspects of human endeavors. Your brain and your nervous system control how you think, they control how you feel, and they control how you act. So, but essentially, what we're doing with psychology is just trying to figure out how all of these things coordinate together to help us to understand what it means to be human. Now, this question of what it means to be human is probably the oldest question in the world. Don't think that psychologists just invented this pursuit. Oh no, my friend, we did not at all. In fact, the practice of essential psychology has existed as long as civilization. You can see the roots of psychology in Vedic scriptures from India thousands of years ago. You can see it in Christian and Muslim religious scripture. You can see it in Greek philosophy, Egyptian philosophy. All of these different philosophical systems, in a sense, questioned and asked what it meant to be human. So it's been around a long time, but psychology has evolved in such a way that it sort of followed the progress of history and technology. And so, what I want to do is to give you an appreciation for how the essential study of what it means to be a human has progressed. And the cool thing is, we are on the cusp of a revolution in psychology based on what we know about bionics, what we know about computers and artificial intelligence. We are on a new epoch in the field of psychology, and psychology is changing. And you are, in the next 50 years, if you folks are lucky enough to live that long, you are going to see some amazing things in the field of psychology. But I digress. Let's go back, and I want you to know that you can think about the development of psychology as having occurred in four what we'll call epochs. You can call them stages, you can call them eras, I call them epochs, whatever. There are four historical periods, movements, changes in psychology. The first is the philosophical movement, the study of essential humanity. And this has existed the longest and been probably the most persuasive study of essential psychology. And then I'm going to talk about some important changes that have occurred in the last couple of 100 years that ushered in what you and I now call modern psychology. Do we have any questions at this point? Do I have any questions? Anybody have any comments? Can you hear me? Does it make sense? I'm preaching to a screen right here, so I'm not sure. Unless I see something in the chat bar, it's hard for me to tell. But I hope this is making sense and interesting to you. Okay, great. So let's move on. So really, you can think of probably the biggest era of psychology as this essential study of what it means to be human. In psychology, the essential definition of psychology is just an intellectual pursuit of what it means to be human. If we take this definition, you can say that philosophy and religion are, in a sense, forms of psychology because they talk about how the human being is built. They talk about how the human being should function. They talk about best practices for the human being to achieve happiness, to achieve productivity, to achieve whatever. So you can think of philosophy, in a sense, as a branch of psychology. Can I give you some early, you could sort of, and the neat thing is you can see the roots of modern psychology in these early philosophical approaches. You may or may not know this, but at one time, there was a discussion about which part of the body controlled the human being. Was it the heart, as the Egyptians believed, or was it the brain, as the Greeks would later suggest? So early philosophers wanted to know what part of the body was in control of the human being's functioning. So, in a sense, that's what we would call modern biopsychology. Now, you're going to see this idea of karma and good acts and right mind and the value of having right mind. And you're going to see these in different sort of Eastern philosophies. And really, what they're talking about is stress or well-being, what we would call modern day well-being, which you might find in health psychology. Um, if any of you come from a Christian background, you probably are familiar with the concept of original sin that was developed from the Christian Bible. In a sense, this is a statement about whether or not we are products of nature or nurture, whether we're fundamentally good or fundamentally evil characters. So you can think of that religious concept as having psychological implication. There's the theory of forms that you're going to see in Plato and some of your other Greek philosophers. And then later on in 17th century France, we're going to get Immanuel Kant and a philosophical treatise on what it means to think and feel and remember. And the deal is, all of these were, in a sense, analytical, thoughtful approaches at trying to understand what it means to be human. However, what I want you to know, what I want you to appreciate is that none of these approaches were based on what we might call modern science. Actually, you know what? Before I go do that, I'd like to take you back to an article that you might be interested in to show how these old philosophers might be thought of as being related to modern clinical psychology. I'd like to take you to an article right here. Do you folks see this article right here? This is in the Atlantic, and I'm going to actually copy it and send it to you. Oh, excuse me. But this is basically a treatise on Aristotle's 10 rules for good living. Aristotle was interested in this idea of eudaimonia, which means good spirit and well-being. And this philosopher, thousands of years ago, had what he believed to be his 10 steps towards eudaimonia or living a healthy life, right? So you can see these philosophies, they're old as the hills, and yet they still are a part of human knowledge and what it means to think, feel, and behave. Is everybody still following me? If you're still here, go ahead and type a hello in the chat bar and let me know you're going. But none of these approaches were what we would call scientific. What differentiates modern psychology from philosophy is is a couple of things, and we're going to talk about it during Epic 2. This is called the birth of scientific psychology. And we typically think of this as occurring in the 19th century, that is the 1800s. But you can think of attempts at breeding a modern psychology as spanning what we might even say the 18th and 19th centuries, or the 1700s and the 1800s. And this is when psychology was trying to add in this one thing to the study of what it means to be human, and they were trying to add in a scientific approach. See, the thing with philosophy and with religion is that they are prescriptive. They tell you what to do, and they are analytical. They are based on people's well-intentioned thoughts. They're good thoughts. They're long-held thoughts. They're closely examined thoughts. But still, none of these philosophies, none of these theories are based on what we would call hard evidence. In science, is the practice of gaining hard evidence to support the theories that you have. So, when we say that something is scientific, we say that what we know about that field is based on observation and measurement. Now, here's the thing. Thousands of years ago, Aristotle had these 10 rules for a good life. And these were probably great rules. But Aristotle never went out and measured to see how often these behaviors led to positive outcomes. He didn't have data and a measurement. All right. And so that's one thing that was missing in psychology, in the study of humanists for thousands of years, that was to be born in the 18th century. Now, if you look right here, I've got some attempts that represent what we call pseudoscientific attempts or false attempts to develop a measured psychology. There's some interesting ones. I don't know if you folks have ever heard of animal magnetism. That was coined by a fellow named Anton Mesmer, who thought that he could move people's magnetic forces. And he went around trying to do demonstrations in France to prove that people had this magnetic force about them. There was a fellow named Franz Gall who thought that he could feel the bumps on people's heads and guess their personalities based on the structures of the lumps on their heads. And then there was a fellow that ran around with a horse named Hans that he proclaimed could count. And he went around showing people how this horse had animal sense, but these were all proved to be sort of fake or fraudulent, but they were at least attempts to begin showing that psychological constructs could be measured. Now, the first scientific measurement of the mind, and this is going to sound stupid. You folks have grown up in a world of IQ tests, personality tests, psychological evaluations. So you have to suspend your today mind and go back to 1850. This guy named Gustav Fechner was the first person to show that the mind obeyed systematic processes and could be measured systematically. And the measurement of human beings that he demonstrated was this thing called the just noticeable difference. And it turns out that there's a very systematic degree between the amount that something changes and your ability to detect that change. What just Gustav Fechner found is that any sensory experience, in order for a human being to detect that that sensory experience is different, it needs to change at least 1/40th of its original intensity. So take a look at these balls over here that I have on the left. You'll notice that I have a standard, and I want you to tell me, is ball one similar, the same color, or different than the standard? Is ball two the same color or different than the standard? Is ball three similar or different? Okay. Now, the crazy thing, it turns out that all three balls are, are different colors than the standard. But it's hard for people to see the difference between ball one and the standard because they have not, the color of blue, the intensity of the blue hasn't changed enough. So, in a sense, the first measurement of the mind was this thing called the just noticeable difference, how much things have to change before people notice them. I don't know if you've ever been in one of those swanky restaurants where they have the dimmer switch for the lights, and sometimes in the middle of the dinner, it's you might think that the lights have gotten dimmer, and you'll turn to your friend and say, "Hey, did the lights get dimmer?" And you'll have an argument about whether or not the lighting in the room changed. In a sense, you're arguing about whether or not this stimulus changed enough to demonstrate a GAND, a just noticeable a just noticeable difference. Now, here's the deal. This was the first scientific measurement of the mind. Before this, people thought that it was impossible to measure the mind. Before you can have a science of the mind, you have to believe that there are general principles by which all minds existed. What I'd like to suggest is that prior to the 1800s, the argument would have been advanced. There's no way you can study what's in people's minds or souls because everybody's mind or soul is unique. Okay? What Gustav Fechner demonstrated was that just like everybody has a body with two arms and two legs, there is a similar psychological structure that is in everybody's mind that can be measured. Do you understand the importance distinction that was made here in 1859 by Gustav Fechner? I hope you do. Maybe you don't, but I hope you do. Now, I've listed two other people who are also very important in the field of psychology. I've got a fellow named Wilhelm James and a fellow named William James and a fellow named Wilhelm Wundt. Now, both of these fellows come a little bit after Gustav Fechner. Gustav Fechner was in the 1850s. Wilhelm Wundt opened the first psychology lab in 1879 in Germany. You can think of Germany as one of sort of the birthplaces of psychology, if you will. Before 1879, you could not be a professor of psychology. There was no way to become credentialed to get a degree saying you are a psychologist. However, Gustav Fechner, Gustav Fechner was the first person to hand out PhDs. Now, a second other important fellow was a fellow named William James. William James was actually a philosopher from Harvard University. He was not a psychologist at all. However, he in the 19th century, in the 1800s, this was before they really had official credentials for psychology. So you could call yourself a psychologist, and if people were interested in what you said, then you were doing psychology. All right. And so William James wrote the first psychology textbook, The Principles of Psychology. And it has often been said that William James's textbook, The Principles of Psychology, formed the roadmap for 20th century psychology. So he was so influential that everybody followed him and this guy named Wilhelm Wundt and Gustav Fechner. Now, what I'd like to do is to show you a picture real quick. You're now looking at my screen. These are early research laboratories, psych departments in the United States, psychology laboratories. And what you're going to notice is that most of these labs are students of three fellows: William James, G. Stanley Hall, which was William James's student, and Wilhelm Wundt. So most of the early psychologists and the ones that would become famous came from laboratories established by these three people. So the impact of these three people cannot be overstated. Gustav Fechner showed that the mind was systematic enough to be measured. Wilhelm Wundt started handing out PhDs and sort of credentialed the field. And William James sort of outlined where psychology should go in the next 100 years. Now, one other thing happened in Epoch 2, which would be incredibly important. Now, you folks are not surprised by this, but if I told you that humans were just another part of the animal kingdom, and that we obey scientific laws and we're part of the animal kingdom just like every other animal. That was not always something you could talk about, and that was not something that modern science sort of allowed. Now, what your book's going to do, every psychology textbook is going to introduce Charles Darwin in chapter 1. Number one, it's because we're going to talk about genetics, evolution, and we're going to talk about evolutionary psychology, human beings as being changing as a result of environmental pressures. And we're also going to talk about what things are inbred into us, what things are nature, and what things are nurture. We're going to talk about nature and nurture. But the most important thing that occurred when Charles Darwin published his Origin of the Species in 1859 was he put human beings into the animal kingdom. He moved us from godlike angels, if you will, that couldn't be measured because we were above and beyond the world of natural science. What he suggested in his book, and this is a subtle point that we now accept, so it's hard to understand. But in 1859, he legitimized the scientific study of the human being as a part of the animal kingdom, right? Before him, it was sort of inappropriate to think about that. If we did talk about human beings in philosophy, we certainly did not talk about them as being evolved animals. We suggested there was a human kingdom and there was an animal kingdom, right? And an animal kingdom has scientific laws and we study it like science. And animals are a little bit, and humans are a little bit different. And we talk and think about them differently. Not with Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, for the first time, argued that human beings are products of evolution. And this would actually lead to some, if you will, some unintended negative consequences. One of them being social Darwinism. I don't know if you've looked around, but some countries, some cultures, some people in different continents seem to have all the resources, and other countries seem to be beset by poverty and hunger and strife and sadness. And social Darwinists would say that these geopolitical variations are the intended consequence of an animal that is striving for superiority. So, social Darwinism would actually say that cultural inequality is actually a good thing. But and that's an argument that we'll carry that we'll talk about next week. But what I want you to appreciate from Darwin is that Darwin in the 18th century said we can study human beings because they are just another part of the animal kingdom. And then right at that same time, Gustav Fechner said, and you know what? This is a demonstration of how the mind obeys a systematic process, that everybody has this mental function that's built into their brain. Do you sort of appreciate what I'm talking about here? This is sort of when psychology was born. Now, from 1850 to 1900, really there were no organizing forces, and psychology was kind of floundering about to figure out what exactly it studied. But I do want you to know that in the 19th century, psychology was legitimized as a science, and human beings were legitimized as a subject for scientific inquiry. Now, from 1900 to 1950, actually, I don't know if you knew this, but you know how the world is so regimented and you have to go get your high school diploma, then you got to get your 4-year diploma, and then you go to graduate school, and you can't miss any one of these steps. And there's this very rigorous process. What you probably don't know is that in the early 20th century, the 1900s, you didn't have to follow that process. Did you know this? In 1900, if you were really smart in high school and you could pass the entrance test, you could go straight from high school right into medical school or right into law school. You didn't have to get an undergraduate degree back then. And college degrees didn't have 120 credit hours where you had to have this many English hours, this many history hours. All of that stuff is really, really modern as education has become systematized. In the 1900s, anybody really who published an article or a book and could convince other people could claim the title of doctor or lawyer or psychologist. And so during the early 1900s, the early 20th century, I would say, psychology was this wild and woolly Western world where we had all of these different people coming from different backgrounds, some of them with psychology PhDs, some with philosophy degrees, some with anthropology degrees, all coming forth and saying, hey, I know how we need to study the human being. This is the most important thing to study about the human being. And so, what happened during the early 1900s, the early 20th century, is psychology developed into probably 6 or 7 different, what we'll call schools of thought. Schools of thought, think of them as groupings of people who were interested in different aspects of what it means to be a human being. Okay? And each of these schools of thought was valid, and each of these schools of thought studied a certain aspect of what it means to be human. Now, being a human is so complex that really you can't study everything about a human being from one angle. So think of these schools of thoughts as 6 different angles, ways of thinking about the human being. All right? Now, I'm going to briefly talk about them, but you'll notice I have live links down here. I hope you click on these links and learn a little bit more about each of these 6 perspectives. And these are just 6 ways of looking at a person. If I asked you to tell me, what do you think people find most important? And you gave me an answer, your answer would reflect one of 6 basic viewpoints, I think. So I could say, why do people do the things they do? And you could give me an answer, and I guarantee you your answer would reflect one of these 6 basic viewpoints. So, why do people do the things they do? The psychoanalytic perspective would say that people are conflicted animals. They have animal instincts. You folks all have it, the instinct to fight, the instinct to have sex, the instinct to eat. But we also have rules, and we all feel guilty about our desires. So, the psychoanalytic perspective would argue that human beings are conflicted animals. We have these inborn instincts, and we have these rules and guilts that drive us. How many of you feel guilty sometime? Do any of you out there feel guilty about the things you feel, the things you think? Is anybody here in school not because you want to be, but because you're trying to make one of your family members happy? If you are a conflicted animal, and the psychoanalytic perspective explains you, right? Now, there are other people who say, you know what, really, if you think about it, human beings are actually a group animal. They are a pack animal, just like dogs and apes are pack animals. You don't see one dog, you see a pack of wolves, let's say, dogs in the wild. You never see one dog in the wild, you see a pack of dogs in the wild. You never see one gorilla in the wild or one chimp in the wild. You see them in gangs and groups. Lots of animals are collective, if you will. And so the social perspective says if you really want to understand people, you have to understand that they are just trying to fit in with the pack. Human beings are social animals. I come from a social perspective. I think really people may be evil and they may be good, but really I think the environment has a bigger effect over who they are. So I think that we have sort of this, it's the social, the people around us. Now, the behavioral psychologists, they were kind of similar to the social psychologist, and they thought it was the environment. But whereas the social psychologists would say it's because we like fitting in and being a part of the group, the behaviorists would say we respond to punishment and rewards in our environment. Okay, you folks are not here because you have nothing better to do. You are here because you think it's going to help your grade. You are, in a sense, a trained animal, and you are learned to do the things that will lead to reward. Conversely, you know to avoid certain things because you don't want to be punished or penalized for them. So the behaviorists would say that we are trained animals, just like dogs and other animals that you can train. Okay. Now, humanists, they don't like this idea. Remember, I suggested to you that when we get Charles Darwin, there's this movement to say that human beings are animals. And if you notice, these first 3 perspectives say that human beings are some type of animal. The humanists say, you know what? Yeah, we may be animals, but there are some aspects of us that are different, that make us uniquely human, and really, those are the important parts of humanity that we should study. Let's not study what makes us similar to animals. Let's study things like hopes and aspirations and fulfilling your dreams. Let's study those kinds of things. Have any of you folks ever heard of Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs? Anybody ever heard of Abraham Maslow? Abraham Maslow was a humanistic psychologist. He would have suggested that all human beings are directed at this thing called self actualization, finding out what your true dream is and living it, right? And so we've got that. Now, There are some people, computers were invented in the late 40s, and we're going to talk about that later in the semester. And when computers were invented, somebody immediately said, wow, what a great analogy for human beings. What if the human mind was the exact same as a computer? It has a memory, it has input, it has output. You know what I mean? And so the cognitive psychologists tried to figure out how computers and brains are similar. And then there are some people who say, yeah, you know what, humans are social animals, but more importantly than that, humans are cultural animals. And you can't just look at the group of people around me. You have to look at things like acculturation, right? So even though we may be in the same family, my brothers and my sisters may be raised differently because they have a male culture and a female culture in my society. One of the things I love about Wake Tech students is you come from around the world. So I have some people who are coming here from African cultures, some people coming here from Middle Eastern cultures. I've got some Asian cultures in this classroom. I've got some Northerners, some Southerners. Each and every one of these cultures really affects who we are as human beings. So, if you think about it, in 1900, nobody really knew what exactly psychology was, okay? But from 1900 to 1950, these very famous people that are going to be described in these links right here said, we think these are the basic sort of ways in which we ought to think about human functioning. Questions, contents, questions, comments? No. Let's move on to the next to last slide. Epic 4. Now, here's the deal. It used to be if you were smart in 1900, you could write a letter to William James and he might let you come straight out of high school into his graduate psychology program. And you might not even have to be an undergraduate. And you know what? You might not have to fulfill any credentialing requirements to get your PhD. You just would have to get your teacher to say, yes, he's a doctor now. But now we don't live in a world like that. We live in a very modern, certified world, a certifiable world, I would say sometimes. You have to have certification. There are rules. Since around, it started probably around World War II. During World War II, there were tons of TBI, traumatic brain injuries. There were tons of people coming back with PTSD. It was called shell shock back then. But people were coming back. A lot of people came back from World War II with a lot of neurological and psychological problems. And psychology had kind of been fooling around and wasn't professionally equipped to handle the onslaught of needs that it faced during and after World War II. So after World War II, psychology becomes super duper professional, and it actually adopts what you might call the medical model with areas of specialization and degree requirements and credentialing requirements. And there became this increased focus on what we'll call clinical psychology, which is helping people with the part of psychology that helps people with psychological disorders. And the APA, the American Psychological Association, started looking an awful lot like the American Medical Association. And so it developed into these professional areas of psychology. Now, I'm not going to go through and talk about all the different history and divisions or the subfields of psychology. But what I want you to see, read on your own, there is a link here that talks about the history and the divisions of the APA. It turns out the APA, the American Psychological Organization, is broken down into tons of sub-clubs, subgroups that are called divisions that are all interested in different areas. So remember I talked about those 6 perspectives? Those perspectives are some of the different divisions, groupings of people by interest. And now one does not just become a psychologist, one actually has to have a professional subfield. I'm not a psychologist. I am a social psychologist. If you have a psychological problem, you don't go to a psychologist, you go to a clinical psychologist. If your fourth grader is having trouble in school, they don't just go to a psychologist, they go to a school psychologist. Do you see what I'm talking about? So there are now common professional subfields. And so when I applied to UNC Chapel Hill to get my PhD, I didn't apply to Carolina. I applied to one of the 8 subfields that was in the Department of Psychology. I applied to third floor to the left of the elevator. That was the social psych department. I didn't become a personality psychologist. I didn't become a developmental psychologist. And so, what I want you to know, just like we have, you have OBGYNs, podiatrists, gastroenterologists, and cardiologists, and these are all, and if you had a heart problem, you wouldn't go to a podiatrist. That would be malpractice. Same thing with psychology. If you need help with a psychological problem, you wouldn't come to a social psychologist. You would go to a clinical psychologist. So we have, if you will, these professional subfields, okay? And also, I do want you to look to see where you will find psychologists at work. There are 2 broad settings where you'll see psychologists: applied psychology and basic research. Basic research psychologists are those people usually in colleges and universities that are doing experiments and research trying to figure out how humans work. On the other hand, if you go to a clinical psychologist or a school psychologist or an organizational industrial psychologist, they are using what basic psychologists learn in the lab to help people in real world settings. Does that make sense? And then if you look in this chart beneath me, what you're going to see is a pie chart that tells you where you'll find all psychologists at work. You need to look at that on your own. Now, one final thing. Here's the deal. Psychology is actually changing. We are maybe on the epic, a new bridge of psychology. Psychology is changing. We are now moving into what we might call the cyborg uh, uh, epic of psychology. Computers, the internet, artificial intelligence, uh, by prosthetics. This stuff, we are now learning enough about psychology that we are beginning to try and incorporate machine and uh, human beings. Oh, actually, you know what I didn't send to you? I'm sorry. Here's the links for the 10 happiness things. And what I want to show you is right here. I'm going to send this link too. I don't know if you know this, but they are now, you can see this on your screen. This is a friend of mine, Sleeman bin Zmeya. He is actually the world-renowned expert on prosthetics, and he is learning how to program limbs such that your brain can move your fingers and use it like a real arm. This guy is probably the coolest of all psychologists, and I did want to share him with you. Now, the reason I am sharing this with you, I hate to say this, but unfortunately, my brilliant friend died unexpectedly last week. But his legacy is going to turn in what I think would be the 5th epic of psychology, when humans and computers, we know enough about computers that we can, about the human mind, when we can begin to interface human beings and computers. Okay, we are now at, let's see, hold on, I think we are at the end. Yes. Okay. All right, that's all I have to say about this lecture. If you came in late, please type your name in the chat bar. I'm not keeping attendance to get anybody in trouble. I'm actually personally interested to see who comes to these videos, just to sort of figure that out for my own interest. So if you would, please go ahead and type your name in the chat bar. Does anybody have any questions about this week's lecture? Anybody have any comments? I do appreciate those of you who managed to stay the entire broadcast. I really do appreciate that. We'll be doing the optional webinars for week one. Either do the discussion board or come to the optional webinar. Hopefully you'll come to the webinar and we'll talk a little bit about philosophy and modern psychology tonight. With that, I'm going to say bid adieu. Have a great day. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me a text. Bye.